Hello, this is Jessica Williams, author of the Imagia trilogy, and I will be reading to you and continuing on where we left off last time. I will be reading The Gateway to Imagia, The Tale of Sam Little, and today we are going to be moving on to Chapter 5, Course Change. Flashes of images raced through Sam's unconscious mind. The images started as simple faces. He saw his mom, dad, grandparents, Titus, Cooper. They were merely silent images that were very familiar to him. Then the images morphed. He saw Yetus and Kisa's friendly faces smiling at him from a strange and beautiful world. The forest behind them began to change just as quickly as it had appeared. It darkened and became an eerie sight that swallowed all of the warmth. It enveloped his friends until they were gone. In their place, he saw glowing eyes advancing from the depths of the darkness. As the eyes grew closer, he could see the faces they were attached to. They were individual entities that were almost a part of the darkness itself. The creatures were slowly encroaching on him. Each one was a frightening image that could only be the product of nightmares. Though he was unconscious, he could feel his heart racing. He could hear their growls and snarls as they bore down on him. Somewhere far away, he could hear a voice. It was warm and full of hope. He searched the darkness for some sign of its source. As the creatures got closer, his heart beat as if he was at a dead run, and he could feel a scream building in his chest. "Sam!" He heard the voice, a beacon in the abyss. He couldn't call out to it. His voice was too small, and the beasts were nearly on top of him. He could feel their hot breath as they closed the circle on him. He heard the voice again. "Sam, can you hear me?" He could think of nothing else to do. He threw his arms over his head, trying to hide from the darkness, and he screamed. The voice heard his cries, and he could feel a tender hand shaking his shoulder. "Wake up, Sam! Open your eyes!" He didn't want to look, but the voice coaxed him on. "You've got to wake up, Sam! If you can hear me, open your eyes!" He could hear someone screaming as he opened his eyes to the brilliant light of day. The screams he heard were coming from his own mouth. As soon as he realized this, he jerked into a sitting position. He was soaked to the bone and gasping for air. The tender hand he felt in his nightmare was holding him steady as he fought to grasp sight of his situation. That same hopeful voice spoke again. "Are you all right, Sam? You were having a nightmare, but you're safe now." Turning to look at the source of the voice, Sam half expected to see his father looking down at him while he lay safe in his bed at home. Instead, he looked up into a pair of gentle brown eyes. His father had blue eyes just like his, so it couldn't be him. A young man, no older than 25, was kneeling there. One arm was on Sam's back, helping steady his position as he stared back up into the stranger's face. The other arm was still on his shoulder for extra support. The stranger had shoulder-length, dark brown hair with a slight wave to it. Half of it was tied back with a rough piece of leather string, while shorter stray strands framed part of his kind face. Though he looked young, his face carried more emotion than one person seemed capable. He had wisdom beyond his time buried in his pale, youthful face. There was no telling how long he had been unconscious, but from the looks of the three concerned sets of eyes now watching him, Sam could tell that he must look very grim at the moment. It was a strange scene to come by. A small 10-year-old boy being safely steadied by a young man on the forest floor, surrounded by two very different creatures, all of them donning looks of concern. To a passerby, it would be a sight to see indeed. No one seemed to know what to say at the moment. Yetu stared down from over the man's shoulder with a look of worry on his face. His black fur was matted and dripping wet. Drops of water trickled off of him, wetting the forest floor. Kisa paced nervously by Sam's head. She threw anxious glances at the small boy with each turn of her body. Despite the fact that tracking her cubs had been ceased temporarily, the looks of concern she wore were for the situation at hand. The young stranger finally spoke again when Sam's breathing slowed to a fairly normal pace. He seemed confident that Sam wouldn't pass back out, so he took his arms away. "How do you feel? You've been better, I assume." A hint of a smile turned one corner of his mouth up as he spoke to Sam. "You'll feel better shortly, though. Are you hurt?" Sam didn't stop to think how he felt. He quickly answered, "No, I'm fine." But his stomach was answering quite differently. Something was stirring, and though it didn't seem possible, his face grew 2 shades paler. "Here it comes," the stranger said, taking a half step away from Sam's head. "Don't fight it. You'll feel better afterwards." At first, Sam wasn't sure what he meant, but suddenly a horrific wave of nausea swept over him, and he broke out in a cold sweat. Without another thought, he rolled over and vomited fiercely. A sickly dark fluid poured from him, the flavor making him pinch his eyes closed, wishing it was over. Just as quickly as the nausea set on, it subsided. He rolled back over and stared back, slightly breathless from the ordeal, at the suspiciously unsurprised stranger. A bit raspy, Sam said, "Oh, that was disgusting." The stranger couldn't help but grin as he responded, "Well, it may have looked good at the time, but that stuff you just gorged yourself on wasn't exactly water. You were lucky. It came back up fast and didn't linger in your stomach." Sam wrinkled his nose and rubbed his stomach. "It didn't feel very lucky," he said. The stranger chuckled briefly, then replied, "Trust me, you were. See, your color's coming back already. Feeling better now?" Sam nodded and realized that he actually did feel better. There was a dull ache somewhere in his back and on his wrist from hitting the ground. He groaned a little as he started to sit up straighter and rubbed his wrist. The stranger nodded back. "Good. Well, I didn't mean to throw you down so hard earlier, but I think you'll understand when faced with the alternative." The hazy fog that had clouded his thoughts earlier had finally lifted, and he was thinking much clearer. He did feel better overall than he had felt recently. Parts of him felt sore. He'd probably bruise later. "I'm fine, I think. But..." Sam could only think of one question for the moment. "How do you know my name?" The stranger smiled down at him, then glanced at Kisa. "Your friend told me while you were unconscious." It seemed so obvious now that Sam almost felt stupid for not realizing it. "Oh, that makes sense, I guess. Sorry. I guess I wasn't thinking." He felt a tingling sense of embarrassment enter his face. The stranger shook his head and tried to ease Sam's mind. "You can't really blame yourself for not thinking. You're in shock. It's hard to think clearly after that kind of ordeal. Don't beat yourself up about it." He smiled again. Yechus was nodding his head in agreement. His expression had finally shifted a bit. He was less worried now that Sam was awake and speaking again. The ordeal was quite a shock to each of their systems, and Kisa also began to slow her pacing as the situation normalized. Sam's mind was definitely returning to full awareness, and the questions were forming a line in his mind. He started with his simplest one. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Taryn," he said as he reached his hand out to take Sam's. They shook hands. Before letting go, Taryn asked, "Do you feel like you're steady enough to stand now?" After an answering nod, Taryn helped pull Sam up. Sam was a mess and a half. He gave himself a once-over. His pajamas were filthy and soaked straight through. Patches of drying mud covered half of him, while leaves and grass stuck to the other parts. Now that he was concentrating on what all had taken place, he could feel his bottom lip tingling. Touching it with one finger was enough to realize that it was slightly swollen. There was fresh blood on his fingers from the small cut that he didn't remember getting. He looked down at his sore wrist. His watch had a crack through the middle and didn't have any sign of the time. He remembered hearing the tinkling sound of his watch breaking in the midst of everything. Broken and worthless, he mindlessly unlatched it and tossed it aside. Now there was no way of knowing how long he'd been here. After taking stock of the situation they had gotten themselves into, Sam realized that he was shivering slightly. Taryn noticed and nudged him back towards the sunny meadow. Yetus and Kisa followed, and they emerged a good distance from the glassy lake. Sam shuddered when he saw the water, and a sinking feeling churned in his stomach. He was realizing the trouble that the creature, now quite invisible again, had caused them all. Sensing the hesitation of the three companions, Taryn felt compelled to ease their worry about the hidden beast. Don't worry about him, he nodded in the creature's direction. He isn't about to come storming out of his hole again any time soon. Once they bait the trap, all they can do is wait until some poor unsuspecting soul wanders in. You're lucky I pulled you out when I did. A few moments more and you've been lunch, you know. He wasn't looking at the lake when he spoke, but rather at the other three, who were obviously unsettled by being so close to it. Sam turned away from the concealed monster in surprise at the way Taryn spoke of it. Him? How do you know it's a him? And does that mean there are more of those things? He was asking the questions through a nerve-cracked voice, while Yetus stood next to him, frozen in shock. Yeah, there are more. Not a great deal more, but enough. And the reason I know it's a male is because the females are a lot bigger. He chuckled to himself. You'd never forget a female once you saw one. He talked about this as though he was entertained by the thought of it all. Bigger? Sam squeaked. Yetus shuddered, and Kisa's ears laid back. She hissed her opinion of the monstrosity. Vile creation. Yeah, vile is right, but easily avoidable if you know what you're looking for. Everyone was confused again, so Taryn clarified. When in your life have you ever seen water that perfectly clear? Or perfectly calm, for that matter? I'd place my bet on never. There is also the fact that the shoreline and shape of the water is too neat. The key to detection is perfection. If it looks too perfect, then chances are that you are looking at a deceptor. It lures you in. Their drool is poisonous and has a drug-like effect on you when you ingest it. Sam's eyes went wide with disgust. You mean that water I drank was actually monster spit? Precisely. Sam remembered what he threw up and frowned as he rubbed his stomach. Taryn hid a grin and went back to explaining. But if you can't grasp the finer details, then you can just look for the eye. He pointed up at a spot that would have been easily missed unless you knew precisely what you were looking for. They all stared where he was pointing. There, in the middle of what looked like an innocent tree line, was a black eye roughly the size of a car tire. It twisted and turned as it hovered there, appearing to be unattached to anything. The sight of it was the most peculiar thing Sam had ever witnessed. The Deceptor's ability to camouflage itself was unmatched to anything. He figured that unless you were expecting to see a random floating eye, it would be next to impossible to spot one floating that high up in such a random spot. The four of them sat in the grassy meadow, letting the sun dry them. Yetus was hardly about to let Sam out of his arm's reach, so sat close by. His wet hair was already half dry after shaking it out like a dog. Kisa never drank or got close enough to the water's edge to get as wet as the other two, so she was already dry and showing signs of her readiness to leave. She didn't speak much, but her pacing seemed to grow more impatient by the minute. Sam, on the other hand, was finding it very difficult to dry out. He tried to distract himself from the uncomfortable feeling of being so soaked by talking to Taryn as they sat there. What happened to me, anyways? How does the Deceptor work? And how did you get me out so fast? He felt safe now, and his curiosity was starting to take hold again. Even though he had just almost been eaten and blacked out, the excitement of it all seemed to overshadow his less than happy moments, and Taryn appeared to be more than willing to shed light on so many of his unanswered questions. He sat cross-legged, adjacent to Sam and Yetus. He, unlike the others, had been barely dampened by the ordeal. Taryn looked up to Sam and thought about something before he responded. You saw the majesty of that water. That's the bait. They create a mirage of the ideal water source. Clear, refreshing, but it's just a mirage. They can blend into nearly any background. No one knows how they do it. All part of the mystery, I suppose. I'm assuming that you understand enough about the water you drank by now, right? Yeah. Well, the water they hold is mixed with their spit, which has some kind of pheromone that the Deceptor releases. Once the water touches your lips, that's all it really takes. It numbs your mind. The more you drink, the harder it is to move. And I'd say you drank a fair share because you seem pretty oblivious to the fact that a gargantuan monster was set on swallowing you whole. He smirked at Sam before going on. Usually they wait until larger groups or entire herds drink, so this one must have been pretty hungry to go on to the whole trouble of unearthing itself for a scrawny boy. I heard the commotion from where I was and could tell that someone was over here. I overheard your Koopa Cat friend yelling for you. I don't generally begrudge something a meal. He looked over at the Deceptor. But seeing as how you were human, I intervened. I ran through the trees to see you being lifted up, and your hairy friend here, he was pointing at Yetus when Sam interrupted him. Yetus. His name is Yetus. And her name's Kisa. Just so you know. He jabbed a thumb in each of their directions. Ah. Noted. Well, anyhow, your friends were putting up quite a fight to get you out. Not that it was a fair match. So I shot an arrow once to distract him. He lowered his jaw enough to grab you, and I pulled you out and pulled you back. Sorry about that again. Is your lip still sore? I think you knocked it on one of the Deceptor's teeth when I yanked you out. Sam felt the swollen part with his tongue. It just hurts a little. No big deal. Regardless of how nerve-wracking it was to picture the whole thing, it was nice to know how it happened at least. Sam's bravado was returning as well. Taryn finished, recollecting with a few last thoughts. So in the end, Deceptors only really have the one vulnerable spot. All it really does is tick them off, though. But if you aim for the eye, then they generally realize that the meal isn't worth the fight. They don't like moving. Lazy, you know. Once they settle, they don't leave unless they need new hunting grounds. This one has been here for a while, from the looks of it. Taryn waited for a moment, then said, So that's that. You blacked out, and the Koopa Cat explained a few things to me that I couldn't understand your bigger friend, of course. He pointed at Yetus. But he conveyed his obvious concern. And there you have it. As Sam was about to point out Kisa's name again, he suddenly caught what Taryn had just called her. He frowned. Wait a second. What did you just call Kisa? With a raised eyebrow, Taryn answered, A Koopa Cat. Why? But that doesn't make sense. I thought she was a Nikor cat. Taryn was about to say something when Kisa spoke instead. What is a Nikor cat? Now he was thoroughly confused. Well, they're cats that look like you, only, kind of different. Kisa didn't say anything. She merely stared at him, baffled. Sam bit his lip and wondered how he could explain. He attempted to make more sense without sounding crazy. Well, when I used to imagine things, I pictured cats that look like you. I called them Nikor cats. The more he explained, the sillier he felt. Taryn stopped him. I gather that she has some slight differences from the creature that you thought she was. Sam nodded. Yeah, they couldn't talk and were mean. Weird. Well, that isn't too uncommon, actually. Taryn didn't even seem slightly surprised by any of this. What do you mean? Sam asked. Now isn't the time to explain that. We should be moving from here for now. It was certain that Taryn wasn't about to explain this further for the moment. It was a lot to take in for Sam. He wasn't sure what to ask next. It had felt like they had been sitting here for a very long time, but it had only really been a short while. He still had so many questions to ask Taryn. Most importantly of all, he wanted to know what happened when he had passed out. Amongst the things he wanted to know was how long he was out for and why he had woken up screaming. He asked himself what could cause such a sound to come out of him. The feelings he had were unfamiliar to him for the most part. He had only felt a hint of these knee-locking feelings since his decision to come here. Sam still hadn't quite grasped what it was he was experiencing. What he felt when he dreamt was similar to this sensation, only magnified tenfold. Luckily, the images of what he saw in his unconsciousness were fading quickly from his mind. As he sat there, Sam silently hoped that Taryn knew more about this world than he did. He'd only been here for what he could only guess as half a day, and already he knew only one thing for certain. No matter how powerful his imagination had been before, it was nothing compared to the amazing things unfolding in front of him now. This world couldn't be solely from his mind. It was something much more, and he was intent on finding out what. All in all, not an immense amount of time had passed since the ordeal with the Deceptor. Each one of them was drier now, and it was apparent that they couldn't sit idly around without a purpose to lead them on. While they all basked in the sun's warmth, Taryn had discovered a good deal of information about all three of them. He was now aware of the initial purpose of the three's traveling. Sam had divulged the entire day's happenings. He explained with the same 10-year-old gusto that he had when telling people about his imaginary ventures. He explained how he found his way into this world and how he had come from a different place where it was still night. He told of Keesa's escape from what he now knew to be a Koopa cat trap, and he even told of their finding of the perfect water of the Deceptor. It turned out that there were some interesting pieces to that particular puzzle. Yet Juice never got around to actually taking a drink of the infectious water. That is why he didn't succumb to the lure of the trap as easily. Keesa had apparently been hissing countless warnings to them. When the Deceptor shuddered into view, she had attempted to distract it by jumping onto its mouth as it raised out of the ground, and Sam found that part particularly touching, since she barely knew him. He also discovered the reason that he lost consciousness was partially due to the pheromones that he swallowed. The only part of his story that Sam had left out intentionally was the wish that he believed brought him to this fascinating place. Taryn had patiently listened to everything and only offered bits of random information here and there. The entire time, the only look on his face was the one of total understanding. Nothing came as a surprise to him. Though he tried to assure them that what they were trying to do was very noble, he was very pessimistic about the entire situation. For some unspoken reason, he was intent on Sam returning back the way he had come from, and for Keesa to accept that finding her cubs would be highly improbable. Sam was grateful for his help, but this was the point in which Sam was becoming very impatient with their rescuer. "I don't understand why you don't want Keesa to find her cubs. And I sure don't understand why you want me to go home. I just got here." His voice squeaked on the last word as he scowled at Taryn. Taryn just shook his head and tried to give Sam a better reason than the danger of the plan that they were all set on following. "You don't seem to understand what you're getting yourself involved in here, Sam. I know for almost certain the reason you are here on this very day, doing what you are doing. You think you are merely having some grand and carefree adventure. And as much as I want to explain the finer details of the mistake you're making, I'm not the one you need to talk to." The scowl Sam had on his face wiped clean away and was immediately replaced by one of utter confusion. Now he was even more baffled. "What do you mean? Who are you talking about? Because if there's someone that can explain stuff to me about this place, I want to meet him. Or her. Or whatever it is." As Sam demanded a new course of action, Keesa leapt to her feet and looked at Sam as if his words were a complete betrayal. She was not willing to stray from her initial plan. She still wanted to track her cubs, positive that the situation wasn't as hopeless as Taryn had insisted. With no sign of wavering in his decision, she hung her head and sighed. "You are choosing to follow a much different path than the one I have to follow, Sam. I have not known you long, but I've grown fond of your company. I will be eternally grateful for your help, but I must find my children. I cannot lead them to torture and famine, if that is indeed where our new friend is sure they will end. Taryn had recently enlightened her of a few of the unfortunate uses for Koopa cats. She paused to think a moment before continuing. Unless this individual you want to seek out can aid in my cub's return, I fear that our time to part ways has already too soon come to pass. Sam looked eagerly to Taryn for an affirmation of this possibility. He didn't want to abandon Kisa. She was the only thing in this world so far that was of any familiarity to him. And when Taryn didn't answer, he asked, "Can this person help her? Even a little bit?" Taryn closed his eyes and rubbed his temples as if warding away a looming headache. He didn't look at Sam when he spoke. "It's possible," he said. Sam looked back to Kisa, hopeful for her continued companionship. She glanced over her shoulder in the direction she longed to go, but turned back to him and nodded. With obvious regret, she said, "I only have mere guesses as to how I can find them. If this individual can truly give me better chances, then—" She paused for only a moment before she finished her thought. "Then I go with you." Yetus, sitting ever protective next to his friend, tousled Sam's messy hair and smiled down at him. Sam didn't even have to ask him to go. It was implied, and his goofy smile affirmed it. "Then what are we waiting for?" Sam said. "Take me to—" He smiled as he imagined finishing the sentence with the words, "your leader." He'd heard that line in about a dozen movies and books, so he was about to opt for something less silly. Then Taryn cocked a smile and finished it for him, only in the form of a question. "Your leader? You have no idea how close you are." Alright, that is chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed listening. I will be reading the next time on to chapter 6, Nightmare. I hope you guys are enjoying the story so far. I've been enjoying reading it to you. Remember that I will be releasing these all the way through to the end. And as always, I hope you guys tune in next time, and thanks for listening. Bye.